Today I'm going to be planting some fruit trees, one of my favorite things to do. But I also thought it would be a good time to bring up what are some common fruit tree planting mistakes. Now, almost all of the things that I'm going to be talking about in this video, I have done myself. I have made these mistakes, but the good thing is that means not only do I know what happens if you make them, but I also know how to avoid them and what you should do instead. So that's what this video is about. Let's get right to it. All right, I think that looks good. So this is the spot where I'm going to be planting this new Texas pink pomegranate bush today. And before I do anything else, all I've done so far is dig out a hole. Before I do anything else, I want to talk about one of the most important things that I've learned about planting fruit trees that's very easy to forget, and that is soil drainage. If you don't double check that your soil drains really well, you're going to have problems with your fruit tree. Most fruit trees, almost all of them I would say, hate wet feet. They hate sitting in soggy soil, and it is one of the quickest ways to cause all sorts of problems, and from just root rot to nutrient deficiencies, and just generally kind of struggling to thrive. You might see that the tree has really stunted growth, or it's not fruiting well, or it drops its fruit because it's stressed out. So believe me, you don't want to mess with this. So luckily, it's really easy to check your soil drainage, and once you've done it in a few strategic places in your yard, you don't necessarily ever have to do it again. So I've done that in my yard already. I've checked the soil drainage, and I actually did a video about that, about a really easy way to check to see that your soil drains quick enough. So I'll be sure to link to that. So if you want to do an official drainage test, go over to that video and do that test that I talk about in that video. But even just sort of generally, next time you get a good heavy rain, observe your yard. See where the water pools. See how quickly the water drains. I mean, do puddles stick around for a long time, especially in certain areas, or do they drain away really quickly? There are a few fruit trees that can handle a little bit soggier situation. And I tell you what, I will also link in the description to an article I did for the Fruit Grove blog all about drainage for fruit trees, and in that I talk about some fruit trees that do better in wet conditions. So the next thing, while I'm over here and as I'm getting ready to plant, I want to talk about the spacing. You can see I've got a pretty big space cleared out. There are conditions where you might be able to plant fruit trees closer together, but unless you get really specific kinds of trees that are dwarf and are meant to stay small, in general, they need a lot of room. They need a lot of room for the roots to spread. They need room for their canopy to grow without too much competition for sunlight and airflow and nutrients and water that the roots can get to. So you always want to pay close attention. That's an easy rookie mistake to make, and it is definitely one that I have made, of thinking, oh, there's no way this tree is going to get that big, even though I see the number on the plant tag of what size it's going to get to. You still hard to imagine, and so I plant my fruit trees too close together, and then I'm sort of wrestling with them and fighting with them to keep them to a manageable size. If you want to avoid that headache, give your tree plenty of room. Okay, so if we come over here to my tree and look at this plant tag, this is the place that'll tell you what you need to know about the size that the tree is going to get. So this tag says that this Texas pink pomegranate tree is generally going to grow to be about 10 feet wide and about 10 feet high, which is the perfect size for a landscape plant, in my opinion. For a bigger landscape plant, let me just modify that a little bit. So this tree, a pomegranate tree, grows a little bit shrubbier. You can train it to be more of a single trunk tree. I don't know if you can see, but this one has a single trunk, but then it branches off into a lot of other branches. I have another pomegranate tree that I've trained to have multiple trunk branches, but they grow pretty wide. Think of like a vase sort of shape. They kind of open up this way. So I do know that I need some pretty good width for this tree, and then 10 feet tall. So I want to make sure there's nothing really competing for sunlight. I do have a crepe myrtle right here, but it's a pretty respectable size, and we keep it pruned. So there's plenty of room up here I can see for the sun to get through the canopy and get to the fruit, which is where we want it. Okay, now we're about ready to get this tree into the ground. So let's talk planting depth, because this is one of the most common mistakes. You see this all over the place in like commercial landscaping where trees are planted too deep. And once again, I have made this mistake myself. And it's sort of an innocent mistake because you would assume when you buy a tree from the nursery that it would be planted at the correct depth, but it's not. They're doing these things so quickly, they just kind of fill up the pots with soil and get them out. So you have to be really careful, particularly when you're planting a tree from a pot like this one. You have to be really careful to adjust the planting depth. So let me show you what I mean. Okay, so I've carefully gotten this tree out of its pot. So what I want you to look for is the root flare. So what that means is right where the trunk meets the root ball and the roots begin to spread out, there's a slight widening of the trunk that happens, and that's called root flare. That's what you want to look for, and that is where you want the plant to be planted. That's where the tree, the soil level should match up with the top of that root ball, and you should be able to see the root flare above the soil line. So since I just got this out of its pot, I'm gonna loosen up these roots pretty good. I like to get rid of excess soil that was in the pot. I figure, you know, I want this tree to get used to my native soil. So I don't want it to be confused. I mean, if you will. I don't want the roots to be confused when they start to branch out and they hit my native soil and it's different than this rich potting mix they're used to. So I'm gonna get rid of a lot of this excess soil, being gentle. Luckily this tree does not look root bound. It has a really nice looking root system. If you notice that, if you look at this tree, if you notice there are a lot of especially bigger roots that are running horizontally in the root ball, if you let those go and just leave them as is, there's a good chance those roots will continue to circle the tree and do what's called girdling, basically choking the tree. This is another really common mistake, and it's another really common reason that new fruit trees might die, is that root girdling. So if you've got those really heavy roots, you either want to trim them or just carefully loosen them and spread them out as best you can. But this one looks good, so I'm getting rid of a lot of this extra soil, and actually, kudos to this nursery, it's actually planted at a pretty good depth. I have gotten trees before that have been planted 3-4 inches above where they should be, even burying the graft union, which is where the tree is grafted to whatever rootstock it needs to be on. Most fruit trees we get are grafted, or at least many of them are. So you want to be sure that that graft union is a few inches above the soil line and that you can see the root flare, the top of the root ball. All right, that's looking pretty good. I feel good about this. All right, so let's get this in position. Now I might have dug my hole too deep. Yep, a little bit. So let me backfill a bit. Okay, that looks good. When in doubt, plant a little higher than you think. It's better to have the tree a little bit elevated and then have to build up the soil around it to the right level. Because remember also, the soil's gonna compact over time and the tree will sink. Yet again, this is something I've seen with a couple of fruit trees I've planted in the past, that I've planted at the right depth, but then had to go back later and try to adjust the soil or keep, digging away the soil to make sure they weren't getting buried too deep. So this looks about right. So now I'm just gonna backfill this hole. Another mistake that's really easy to make, because you see it everywhere, is staking a young tree. Now, hang on just a minute, because there are a few circumstances we need to know about. But as a general rule, if you can get by without staking your tree, that's what you should do. The goal is to help the tree to strengthen, and the way that happens is it to just actually withstand the elements and the wind and everything else, so that the roots can grow and strengthen, the trunk and branches strengthen, and that is just going to lead to a healthier, more productive tree in the long run. But now there are some reasons where you might want to stake, but again, as a rule, it is not required. I am not going to stake this tree for a couple of really important reasons. For one thing, the root system looked really good. The canopy right now is in proportion to the size of the root ball. If it wasn't, if this was just really big and overgrown, but the roots looked kind of underdeveloped, I would cut it. I would just prune everything way back so that everything was a little bit better in proportion. But as it is, it looks really healthy. I'm also not gonna stake it because of where it's located. I'm here by my long 8-foot garden fence, or 7-foot fence, I believe it is. And I've got these big shrubs and a couple of other trees nearby, all of which are gonna be blocking the worst of the wind. So this is a sheltered area. So if you're in a really windy area, or you're worried about weather, or you think the tree might tip over, that's when you wanna stake your newly planted tree. Only for as long as necessary, maybe a few months, 6 months, maybe up to a year, depending on how it's growing and the circumstances. But don't assume you have to stake. You don't necessarily have to, and most of the time it's better not to. One more quick thing before we leave this pomegranate tree, and that is, don't make the mistake that I have made in the past of leaving the plant tag on the tree for too long. Because as the tree grows, that plant tag that's flopping loosely right now is going to get tighter and tighter, and it will eventually basically cut off the circulation of the tree, and that whole portion of the tree, maybe even the whole upper part, won't be able to get the water, nutrients, carbohydrates, everything that it needs to survive. And so, believe it or not, that's actually a really common reasons that new fruit trees will die within the first year or two, because somebody left the plant tag on. So get in the habit, take off the tag right away when you plant it. So here's the other tree I just finished planting. This one is a pineapple guava tree, but I planted it the same way as I did before, being careful not to plant it too deep. So let's talk about a really common mistake that it's really easy to make if you're new to planting fruit trees, and that is watering. How much do you water a newly planted fruit tree? So I'm gonna say, in general, probably more than you think. But it's not about frequency, it's about how deep you're watering. So as a rule of thumb, when I first plant a fruit tree, I try to water it roughly twice a week for the first month or so, depending on the weather. And then after that, I start spacing it out to about once every week or 10 days. Of course, it depends on a lot of things. It depends on the weather. So it's fall right now. It's not as hot. The sun's not shining as intensely, so the plant isn't losing tons of moisture from the leaves, so it doesn't need to be watered as frequently. If you're planting in the spring and the weather's warming up and you want it to make it through the summer, you're going to want to water a lot more frequently. But the big key is, how deep are you watering? You want to water slow and long so that the whole root ball, this whole planting area, gets nice and moist. A really easy mistake to make is to water too shallowly. So just a little sprinkle occasionally is not going to do any good. So you're better off spacing out your waterings, but making sure you're watering really deeply. So there are a couple things that I do to make it that much easier when I've just planted a fruit tree. For one thing, I really like to use these, I call them donuts, these watering bags that you can put around a fruit tree, especially a young one. Fill it up with water, and then it has emitters in the base that just trickle out the water over about 8 hours or so. So that ensures that it's really soaking into the ground, not just draining straight through. These watering bags have gotten my new fruit trees through some really, really hot, dry summers, so I'm a huge fan of them. But another really easy thing you can do, it's kind of like making your own watering donut, is to make what's called a berm around a tree. So let's see, about, I don't know, maybe a foot away from the tree. This tree's small, so a little less. I'm just gonna build up a little wall of soil all the way around the tree. And what this does, it basically creates a little bowl, so that when it rains or when I water it, when I irrigate, it keeps the water in the area of the root ball rather than just running off before it has a chance to soak in. So that allows it to soak in and go down further and just keep it all in this one little area. So this is a really great thing to do when you first plant a fruit tree. Makes it a lot easier to water it the right way, and just leave it in place until it either just sort of washes away, or maybe for the first 6 months or so, just to help get the root ball established, make sure it gets really good deep watering for the first little while. All right, so you can hardly walk down the street without seeing this tree planting mistake, and that is piling up the mulch too high around the tree. It's a little hard to tell with this little tree, but you see this all the time in commercial landscapes or like medians down the middle of a street where the mulch is piled up against the trunk of the tree several inches. You'll hear this called mulch mountain or a mulch volcano, that the mulch is piled up like this. This is a huge problem, and the reason is it can choke the base of the tree, it can cause girdling, it can cause rot to happen and moisture to be trapped right at the base of the tree. It invites pests and diseases. It's the same idea as planting the tree too deep. The tree hates it. So you always, when you mulch, you want to make sure you pull it away from the base of the tree and leave some space. Leave a little air around the trunk itself. Avoid mulch volcanoes at all costs. I've got my 2 trees planted in the ground, but there's one more thing I have to do before I consider this job done, and that is to protect the bark of the trunk. So there's so many things that can damage these thin-barked young fruit trees. So sun scald, right? When the sun shines strongly during the day, but then gets really cold at night, that can cause the bark to split and damage and all sorts of problems to happen. Pests, diseases, animals chewing, even, random string trimmers and lawn mowers bumping into the trunk and causing damage. We want to protect from all that, because even though we think of a tree as strong, it's really like a delicate little young thing. So we got to protect it. My favorite 2 things to use are either a tree wrap like this one, this white fabric that you just wrap around the trunk of the tree and tie off, and that's going to help protect from sun scald and from rodent damage. But what I really prefer to use is this. This is IV Organics 3-in-1 Plant Guard, and it is a really wonderful product. It sort of has the consistency of a watered down paint, but it's going to do a lot of great things. It protects from sun scald by reflecting the sunlight. It also has antifungal and antibacterial ingredients in it to protect from diseases, and it has ingredients that animals and pests don't like, so it's even going to keep those away. So that is my last task, to protect my young fruit trees. Whatever you use, the moral of the story is don't forget to protect these trees that you just planted. Whether you're a novice gardener or you've been growing fruit trees for a long time, it's always the same. It's an investment of time and money and attention every time you plant a fruit tree, but it's an investment that is always worth it. So my hope is that with this video, kind of with the knowledge of all of these planting pitfalls and how to avoid them, that you can feel confident adding some new fruit trees to your garden. Let me know in the comments, what are some fruit tree planting mistakes you've made in the past? I know I've made plenty, as I've admitted, but that's what helps you learn, That's what gives me the confidence to keep going and to know that next time I know exactly what to do. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.